The Atlantic Ocean, a vast blue mystery. For centuries, no one could imagine what lay beyond. Then, in 1492, a handful of wooden ships, guided by hope and boldness, plunged into the unknown. What they found would change the world forever. But at what cost? Long before Europeans dared to cross oceans, the Americas existed, separated from Europe, Asia, and Africa by thousands of miles of open sea. For more than 10,000 years after the last ice age, the lands of the Americas developed entirely on their own. The people living there, the indigenous societies, built cities, farms, and cultures that were completely distinct from the so-called Old World. In those lands, creatures roamed that you could only find there. The crops that native people cultivated, maize, potatoes, beans, tomatoes, chili peppers, were totally unknown in Europe, Asia, or Africa. Meanwhile, Europeans were used to wheat, barley, cattle, and sheep, a completely different agricultural and ecological setup, because the continents had been isolated for millennia. The Old World diseases that plagued Europe and Asia, like smallpox, measles, and influenza, had never reached the Americas. Native Americans had absolutely no immunity to them. Their lives and societies were shaped by their own environment, not by diseases brought from afar. By the late 1400s, the world was essentially split in two great civilizations, two sets of life, almost entirely disconnected. Back in Europe, by the 1400s, many rulers, sailors, and merchants looked east for riches, spices, silks, and gold. But the traditional land routes to Asia were long, dangerous, and controlled by powerful states. The legendary wealth of India and China was a huge temptation for European monarchs. However, the political and military climate, including conflicts in the Mediterranean and Ottoman expansion, made those eastern routes extremely risky. So, a bold idea started to emerge. Maybe the world was round. Maybe you could sail west across the ocean and reach Asia directly. A few people believed in this theory, including a determined navigator named Christopher Columbus. Columbus argued that by sailing west from Europe, you could arrive in Asia shortcut that promised huge rewards. After facing rejection from several courts, Columbus finally secured funding from the Spanish monarchy, Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile. In 1492, they granted him ships, a crew, and a sliver of hope. What followed would become one of the most significant voyages in all of human history. On August 3, 1492, Columbus set sail from Spain with 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria Letters. The crew faced weeks of open ocean, filled with uncertainty, fear, and a glimmer of hope. Many of them must have wondered if they would ever see land again. Then, on October 12, 1492, a lookout spotted Landan Island in what we now know as the Bahamas. They had done it. They had crossed the ocean and reached a new land. Columbus, however, firmly believed he had reached Asia, the Indies, though it was actually part of a continent Europeans had never known existed. Columbus and his crew encountered the native people, the Taino to them. The Europeans seemed utterly strange. With their different clothes, their metal weapons, and their foreign beliefs, to the Europeans, the land was full of promise, new resources, potential for gold and spices, and fertile ground. This was the exact moment when 2 separate worlds first touched. When Columbus returned to Spain with the news, the world's map was redrawn, at least in the minds of Europeans. The new world was born. Suddenly, Europe, Asia, and Africa realized there were entire lands beyond what they knew and known peoples, cultures, and riches waiting across the ocean. The new world seemed like a dream come true for many in Europe. Reports came back speaking of fertile land, strange but valuable plants, and incredible opportunities. Some saw it as the next great frontier, a chance to start anew, gain wealth, and build empires. On the American side, the arrival of Europeans began a slow but dramatic transformation. Soon, more voyages would follow. Not just by Columbus, other explorers, settlers, and colonizers would arrive, bringing with them their culture, religion, language, and their ideas about ownership and civilization. Animals that were completely unknown in the Americas, like horses, cattle, pigs, and sheep, were brought over by European settlers. These animals quickly and drastically changed the environment, the economy, and the lifestyles of native peoples. On the flip side, incredible crops from the Americas, potatoes, tomatoes, and chili peppers, began their journey to the Old World. This exchange would have massive global consequences. While that first voyage looked like a discovery, it was also the first step toward a transformation that nobody could have possibly foreseen. The arrival of Europeans in the Americas launched what historians call the Columbian Exchange, a vast ongoing global interchange of plants, animals, diseases, people, and ideas between the Old World of Europe, Asia, and Africa, and the New World of the Americas. From the Americas to the rest of the world came maize, potatoes, beans, tomatoes, chili peppers, and tobacco foods and substances that completely changed diets, economies, and even global populations. From the Old World to the Americas came wheat, rice, sugarcane, and domesticated animals like horses, cattle, and pigs, along with European crops and technologies. Farming, animal husbandry, new diets, new economies, the Americas would never be the same. And this is the tragic side of the story. The Columbian Exchange also brought diseases: smallpox, measles, influenza, typhus diseases against which indigenous populations had no natural immunity. The result was catastrophic. In some regions, native populations plummeted dramatically. Entire societies collapsed. Once thriving civilizations lost their people, their culture, and their future. The seemingly great discovery masked a silent disaster for millions of people. It's tempting to celebrate Columbus and the discovery of America as a heroic, world-changing event, and in many ways, it was. Human history shifted dramatically because of that voyage. Maps were redrawn, global trade routes shifted, cultures began to merge, nations, wealth, and power all evolved in ways that were previously unimaginable. But discovery also meant destruction. Native peoples lost their lands, their societies, and their lives. The arrival of foreign diseases, ecological disruption, colonization, and forced labor changed the fate of the New World forever. The human cost was absolutely enormous. That dual nature of wonder and horror, of opportunity and tragedies, what makes the story of the Americas so powerful. And that is the story worth telling. Not a simple fairy tale of conquest, but a full, honest account of what this world-shifting encounter actually meant for everyone involved. So why does this moment still matter so much today? Because of that first voyage, our world is connected in ways people 500 years ago couldn't even imagine. The food you eat, the languages spoken in the Americas, the incredible mix of people and cultures. So much of it traces back to that moment when Columbus crossed the Atlantic. The global economy, modern capitalism, colonial empires, and cultural exchanges. Many aspects of our modern world have deep roots in the arrival of Europeans to the Americas. The Columbian Exchange laid the foundation for globalization centuries before it became a buzzword. But at the same time, the inequalities, the injustices, the complex legacy of colonization and cultural erasure, all of these stem from that collision as well. Understanding this history helps us understand the incredibly complex world we live in right now. This is where our world forever changed. That voyage triggered transformations that were ecological, social, cultural, and demographic. But many of the biggest consequences, both hopeful and tragic, were yet to fully unfold. In our next video, we will explore what happened next. The deeper impacts of colonization, the collapse of native civilizations, the rise of global trade, the dark legacy of slavery, and how the discovery still echoes in our world today. The seeds were sown, but soon, forests would burn, empires would rise and fall, millions would die, and a new global era would begin. Columbus's first voyage had opened a door, but no one could have imagined the storm that would follow. Entire civilizations would be transformed, the map of the world rewritten, and the balance of power forever changed. The age of the New World had begun, but with consequences few could foresee. After Columbus's initial voyage, Europe's interest in the Americas exploded. Spain, Portugal, England, and France all sent explorers seeking wealth, land, and influence. Conquistadors like Hernan Cortes and Francisco Pizarro sailed to the Americas with incredible ambition and ruthless determination. Cortes, for example, arrived in what is now Mexico in 1519 by forming alliances with rival indigenous groups and leveraging the devastating impact of diseases like smallpox. He managed to defeat the mighty Aztec Empire. Cities were conquered, empires toppled, and lands were seized. A decade later, Pizarro invaded the Inca Empire in South America, exploiting internal conflicts and again unleashing disease and warfare that decimated native populations. Colonization was not a gentle process. Europeans imposed their languages, religions, and political systems. Indigenous people were forced into labor, and their lands were claimed as European possessions. The New World became a stage for power, conquest, and exploitation on a scale never seen before. The Columbian Exchange, which we touched on in Part 1, now accelerated dramatically. This was about far more than just food or animals. It reshaped economies, societies, and environments on both sides of the Atlantic. From the Americas to the Old World came corn, potatoes, cacao, vanilla, tomatoes, chili peppers, tobacco, and peanuts. These foods began spreading across Europe, Asia, and Africa. The potato, for instance, revolutionized European agriculture, fueling massive population growth and reducing the threat of famine. Chocolate, made from cacao, became a global obsession. Meanwhile, from the Old World to the Americas, Europeans introduced wheat, sugarcane, rice, barley, coffee, horses, cattle, pigs, and sheep. Horses, in particular, transformed the way many indigenous societies traveled and hunted. But along with these crops and animals came European diseases, smallpox, influenza, and measles. These invisible invaders wreaked havoc, killing millions and weakening societies long before Europeans even attempted conquest. The exchange also triggered huge economic transformations. Silver and gold from the Americas fueled Europe's rise in global trade and wealth. Colonial empires gained unprecedented power. Europe became the new epicenter of global capitalism, while the Americas became sources of labor, resources, and strategic advantage. While the exchange brought economic prosperity to Europeans, the cost to indigenous peoples was catastrophic. Entire civilizations were decimated by disease, war, and forced labor. Scholars estimate that within a century of Columbus's first voyage, up to 90% of the native population in some areas of the Americas perished. It was a demographic collapse of staggering proportions. Yet not all indigenous people were passive victims. Resistance took many forms: revolts, escapes, the quiet preservation of cultural practices, and adaptation. Communities fought to retain their identity, their religion, and their way of life, even under the most oppressive conditions. Many managed to survive and adapt, creating hybrid cultures that persist to this day. The European conquest also relied on a cruel system of forced labor known as the encomienda. Under this system, natives were compelled to work in mines, on plantations, and in settlements. Those who survived the initial waves of disease and violence were often exploited to fuel European ambitions for gold, silver, and land. The destruction of native populations created a massive demand for labor that Europeans met by bringing enslaved Africans across the Atlantic. This transatlantic slave trade became one of the darkest legacies of the Age of Discovery. Millions of men, women, and children were kidnapped from their homes, transported under horrific conditions across the ocean, and forced to work in plantations and mines throughout the Americas. This forced migration created a global racial and cultural transformation, laying the foundations for the complex multicultural societies we see in the Americas today. The African diaspora contributed profoundly to music, food, language, and religion, leaving a permanent and powerful mark on global culture that continues to evolve. The discovery of the Americas shifted global power dramatically. Spain and Portugal, and later England and France, amassed incredible wealth and expanded their empires across the globe. Silver from the mines of Potosi in modern-day Bolivia flooded Europe, funding wars, trade with Asia, and further exploration. Colonies became engines of wealth, fueling European influence and completely reshaping international politics. The Americas became a laboratory for European ambition. New trade routes crisscrossed the Atlantic, connecting continents like never before. What had started as a quest for a new route to Asia became a project of colonization, empire building, and fierce global competition that would define the next several centuries of world history. Despite all the violence and suffering, the blending of cultures created something entirely new. Languages, religions, art, cuisine, and traditions merged across continents. Spanish, Portuguese, English, and French, brought by the colonizers, became dominant. But indigenous languages and practices survived, often blending with the new influences. African cultural traditions blended with native and European customs, creating the rich multicultural tapestries we see across the Americas today. Even now, we see the legacy of this history everywhere. Festivals, music, dance, and food all bear the marks of this collision: cacao and Chile from the Americas, European instruments and architecture, and African rhythms and music are all products of a world connected, for better or worse, through the Columbian exchange. In recent decades, modern perspectives have challenged the traditional glorification of Columbus as a hero. While his voyages were acts of incredible bravery and navigational skill, they also initiated a devastating chain of conquest, exploitation, and suffering. Many historians argue that discovery is a misleading term. The Americas were already inhabited by millions of people living in thriving civilizations with complex societies, rich cultures, and long histories of their own. Today, we can celebrate the spirit of exploration, curiosity, and the expansion of human knowledge. But we must also remember the immense human cost: the lives lost, the cultures destroyed, and the centuries of inequality that followed. Acknowledging true history means embracing its complexity, both the triumphs and the tragedies. The story of the Americas is not just a tale of the distant past. It teaches us profound lessons for our modern globalized world. First, it demonstrates just how interconnected our world can become, for better or for worse. The Columbian exchange was the first true globalization, showing how actions on one continent can have massive unforeseen consequences on another. Second, it teaches us about responsibility. Every great discovery or technological leap carries consequences, often for those who are least responsible for them. Third, it's a story of resilience, the survival and adaptation of indigenous and enslaved peoples who preserved their cultures against all odds, show the incredible strength of the human spirit. And finally, it reminds us that history is never simple. Every story has multiple perspectives, and the truth is often found in the gray areas. When we eat a potato, drink a cup of hot chocolate, ride a horse, or listen to music born of African, European, and indigenous influences, we are living in a world shaped by the age of discovery. The arrival of Europeans in the Americas marks a fundamental turning point in human history. It was a moment of awe and ambition, curiosity and conquest. It brought new foods, ideas, and connections across continents that had been separated for millennia. But it also caused unimaginable suffering and loss. The collision of these worlds reshaped humanity, creating unprecedented wealth and power for some, and dispossession and tragedy for others. The legacy of that moment continues to influence our politics, economies, cultures, and identities to this very day. By understanding the full story, the adventure, the conquest, the devastation, and the resilience, we can better appreciate the depth of our shared history and learn from its complex lessons. The discovery of the Americas reminds us that human history is never simple. Every step forward carries risk and consequence. Every new horizon touches lives in ways we can never fully predict. The world we live in today is the direct result of one daring voyage and the countless choices, both good and bad, that followed. Thanks for watching. If you found this journey into history valuable, please like, subscribe, and share.